with technical difficulties. Yes. So, yes, you've heard my name. It's my pleasure to present to you. I am Mladen Čičić. I'm currently a postdoc at Berkeley. I did my originally I'm from Serbia. I did my bachelor's and master's at University of Belgrade School of Electrical Engineering. I did my PhD at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, where I worked with Professor Carl-Henrik Johansson on the modeling and Lagrangian control of mixed traffic. After that, I was a postdoc at the GIPSA lab in Grenoble, working with Professor Carlos Canudas de Witt on modeling and control of electromobility. And I'm, like I said, currently a postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley, where I'm working with Professor Maria Laura Delle Monache on micro-macro modeling and control of mixed traffic. So in general, my research so far has, if you split it into two main topics, that would probably be modeling and Lagrangian control of traffic, which is indeed what I will be talking about today. And then the other topic is modeling and control of coupled EV traffic and power systems. So how electric vehicles, describing in a macroscopic way, how electric vehicles are moving, how they're charging, and how that charging interacts with the power system. So that's what I was working on in Grenoble, but if that's something that you're interested in, come talk to me afterwards, but that's not what I'm talking about today. So I like to start my talks by like a big motivation picture, and I think when talking about traffic, that's a relatively easy thing to motivate because that's something that people have direct experience with. So we might not have daily interactions with quantum physics, but we definitely do have daily interactions with traffic. And the problem with, the reason why it's important to talk about traffic and traffic control is because of traffic congestion. And I think, again, it's not hard to motivate why traffic congestion is a problem, because on the personal level, it wastes our time, but it also causes an increase in emissions. A lot of wasted productivity, and it also increases the probability of traffic accident. So transportation sector, so these are the numbers from 2020. Transportation came in as quite a significant portion of CO2 emissions. This is these are the figures for EU. For the US, it's even more pronounced. And out of transportation, it was road transportation that was by and large taking the majority of these emissions. So it is clear that we should do something about it, or we should try at least doing something about it. And there are some standard ways of dealing with congestion or trying to mitigate it. And the most, let's say, classically applied control methods are what they call the Eulerian, and it will become clear hopefully soon why Eulerian. Traffic control methods, they rely on stationary equipment. So you have stationary sensors, such as induction loops in the streets, or you have ultrasound sensors on these gantries or similar things like that. So you use those for sensing to learn about what's going on in the traffic, and then you implement control using stationary actuators, such as traffic lights or variable speed limit signs or things like that. Now, more recently, there has been an emerging paradigm of traffic control that is coming at it from a Lagrangian perspective. So instead of using stationary sensors and actuators, here the idea is to use mobile sensors and actuators. So essentially to use vehicles that are part of the traffic as sensors and actuators themselves. So on the side of sensing, you can use even just the trajectories of connected vehicles, but also if you have access to their onboard sensing suites, you can use what they are perceiving about their environment in order to learn something about the overall traffic state, at least locally close to them. And then on the side of actuation, if you're able to communicate with these vehicles and change how they're behaving in the traffic, then you might be able to affect how the traffic dynamics are evolving and control the traffic in some sense. So with that in mind, the question that I'm trying to answer in this talk is how can we reduce traffic congestion using only a small portion of connected vehicles? And one of the main kind of inspirations behind using mobile vehicles are what you see exactly here. So what you see here is a stop and go wave. A stop-and-go wave is, you can define it as an upstream propagating zone of congestion without an apparent bottleneck. So essentially, someone on the road taps the brake, then the person behind them taps the brake a bit harder, and then like 50 meters upstream, you have someone that is at the complete standstill. So you can see another stop-and-go wave go through. And empirically, what's interesting about these is that empirically these waves are moving upstream at around a constant speed. And what's interesting about them is that the outflow from the stop-and-go wave is typically lower than the capacity of the road. So because vehicles have to accelerate out of it, the throughput is sacrificed to some degree. And the problem with these is that in general, they can arise wherever on the road. So they're not linked to a specific location where you have a merge or something, although they're more likely to arise there. And because of that, it is not easy to address those using standard Eulerian traffic control methods, which rely on stationary equipment, because you don't know really where you will need to put this equipment. So instead of relying on that, it might make sense to try using moving actuators and sensors, which is really I would say, the main motivation behind using Lagrangian control to deal with, because we have a moving phenomenon, we might need moving sensors and actuators to deal with it. So the overall structure of the talk you see here. So in the first part, I will present the overall structure of the traffic control loop, Lagrangian traffic control loop. I will very briefly go through all elements of it. And then I will talk about something a bit more recent and probably something that is a bit more close to what you all are working on, trying to bring the whole traffic control story a bit closer to vehicles themselves, but more on that soon. The overall traffic control, Lagrangian traffic control loop looks something like this. So again, I will basically go through this whole loop, starting with the sensing, the actuation, the traffic model, the model learning, the traffic state reconstruction and prediction and control law. So basically, I will be going in the first part, I will be going through this control loop and explaining all parts, starting with the model. Now, I do not believe you are very familiar about traffic modeling, am I right?
Yes,
Somewhat, but yeah. Well, it is not, well, if you think about how to model traffic overall, if you're thinking about the individual vehicles, you really cannot go, you really cannot go simpler than just looking at their longitudinal motion. You have their position, they evolve according to whatever their speed is, and then their acceleration will depend somehow on the gap between the vehicle itself and the vehicle downstream of it, and then also the speeds and the differences in speed. But we can try to even go further and say, well, if we're able to represent the traffic state in an aggregate manner by the traffic density, then we can even say just, well, the speed will at a certain point where the vehicle is, will just depend on the general traffic conditions that are around this vehicle. And that's overall how we end up with the simplest form of traffic flow model, which is in this case the Lighthill-Witham-Richards model. So this model is just a simple conservation law that describes the evolution of traffic density, rho, and the traffic flow in this case, Q, is directly defined as a function of the traffic density. Now, this relation, traffic density to traffic flow relation can take one of many forms. It can, but typically what you end up, typically what it looks like is something like this. So in general, up until some traffic density, the flow will be increasing as the traffic density increases because we have more and more vehicles. And then after this point, which is the critical density, as the traffic density increases, the flow will start decreasing because we're having more and more congestion and we're closer and closer to a complete traffic jam. Equivalently, so the traffic flow is just equal to traffic density times traffic speed. So that equivalently, you can think of this relation by looking at the traffic speed. And the traffic speed is at some maximum level up until some density, and then it starts going down monotonously. What this looks like what does this mean for how the traffic density will evolve? Well, if you solve this PDE, or if you find the solution somehow, you will get something like this. So there will be a number of plots like this throughout the talk, so I'll spend a bit more time explaining it here. Every time you see a color map like this, space will be on x-axis and time will be on the y-axis. So here what is happening is in the upstream part, so for negative positions initially, you have some, and yes, what is shown color-coded is in this case, the traffic density. It will always be traffic density. So what you see here initially is you have a relatively low traffic density upstream of some point, and a relatively high traffic density downstream of some point. And then the way this evolves is just this wave front that separates these two densities will propagate in some direction. In this case, it is moving slowly upstream. So you can think of this as the end of the congestion shifting up the road slowly. If the situation is reversed, we'll get something a bit different, where what the model is predicting is that you will get, in a sense, a gradual rarefaction of the traffic conditions. So you go from dense traffic to less dense traffic and then towards free flow gradually. So I will not go too much into details here, but just to kind of give you an overall picture of what kind of a system we're dealing with and what we're trying to control. And how can we control it? Well, if you think about it, how can we affect the traffic that consists of many vehicles by trying to control only a single vehicle? Is that realistic? Well, I mean, if you're a police car, it is very realistic. And what you see here is a police car performing what's called a traffic brake. So this maneuver is typically done for safety reasons, where there's some accident or something downstream of this, where the car would just kind of start meandering around the road and blocking the entire traffic flow. So that is a bit of an extreme case, but it shows that we can affect the traffic using a single vehicle. Now, a bit more realistically, if you think about what we can do, well, we really have two inputs to kind of control each of two inputs, two ways to enter this system. So thinking of a single vehicle, we are definitely going to be able to issue some sort of a reference speed for it that it tries to follow, but it does not necessarily need to follow, because if we give it a very high speed, then it might not be able to follow that speed due to traffic conditions. And this speed will basically determine its longitudinal motion. And then apart from that, we might be able to in essence, set some target lanes for it. So tell it, go all the way to the right, or take the second lane from the right, or something like that. Now, the reason why this might be important is if you have a truck platoon, such as you see here, if you command one of these trucks to, instead of following this lane, to come to the next lane, then all of a sudden you have a bit of a different picture. So whereas in the beginning, the trucks were taking only one lane and restricting the traffic in that way, now if these trucks are moving slowly, they will be quite a bit of they will restrict the traffic flow quite a bit. You're blocking 2 out of 3 lanes, so that should affect the situation quite a bit. The way we can model that is by considering these trucks to be moving bottlenecks, which they, I mean, if you've driven behind the truck, there definitely are acting as moving bottlenecks, but here is how we do that mathematically. So essentially, while the traffic flow elsewhere on the road will be, and by the way, just to interject, if there are some questions that you have in the meantime, if there's something that you want extra explained, or if there's something that's really interesting for you, please let me know. I can spend more time there, and then there are times that I might like modularly remove from the talk. So just to let you know, and then I'll continue. Yes, so the way we can model this is we can have some big flux function, or some non-scaled down flux function, and that flux function will describe the traffic dynamics of an open road where there is no moving bottleneck that is restricting it. And then if you have a one lane blocked, then the way you can think about it is it's like having a road that is that is narrower, that has a lower capacity. And the way we can represent that is just by scaling down this flux function. So for a lower density, we'll have for the same density, we might have a lower flow. And the thing is complicated, or the equations are complicated a bit by the fact that this bottleneck is moving. And essentially what will happen is, if there is enough traffic flow to kind of have, to activate, in a sense, this bottleneck, what we will end up with is we will have a higher density upstream of this moving bottleneck and a lower density downstream of this moving bottleneck. And these 2 points you can see on the flux function according to this line, which is the slope of the line is equal to the speed of the moving bottleneck in this case. Spending a bit more time here, it will become more important later on. But that is in general what you would expect. So if there's a slow-moving truck, there will be some congestion upstream of it, and then downstream, well, there are not as many vehicles. So this is the situation that we might get for a moving bottleneck that is blocking one lane. If the moving bottleneck is blocking more lanes, then we just scale down this flux function even more, and the congestion that is created is more severe in this case. We can mathematically we can represent this by an LWR model, but now we have this flux function that is dependent on space-time. So essentially, what I was talking about, where the road is open, we have one flux function, which is the big one, and then where we have our moving bottlenecks, we will have a different reduced flux function. That's one way to think. Essentially, we're restricting the overtaking flow. Now, that's basically the situation when it comes to the actuation. That's how we can affect one way. We can affect the traffic flow. What about sensing? So, if you are, well, next time you're in San Francisco, you can, well, experience an autonomous vehicle. You can hail Waymo. And one thing that was really interesting for me was in Waymo, you have this screen that is showing you essentially this. So it is showing you what the robotaxi is perceiving around it. And the first time I was in Weimar, this was really interesting for me, because what you see is the vehicle, which has a LiDAR and many other sensors around it, it has a pretty good picture of what's going on around it. So it knows where all of the other vehicles are, because, I mean, it has to be able to know where they are, because otherwise it's not very safe. But the point is, just having a look at that, my question was, well, okay, well, can we use this to measure the traffic state? Can we use this as in essence, a sensor for the traffic conditions? And with a bit more work, yeah, I would say we can pretty much do that. So essentially, there is an extra step that we need to take. So what we can assume is that these vehicles, based on their kind of situational awareness and based on their sensor suite, will have some idea, we will be able to track the vehicles that are in some vicinity around them. So if the vehicle is here, it will probably be able to see what is happening close by around it. Now, what that gives you is just a position of all of these vehicles. That does not give you a density. But then you need to go from this representation of the presence of other vehicles to some representation of the traffic density, the traffic density profile around it. There are many ways you can do that. You can just split the space into kind of cells and then count how many vehicles you have in each cell and divide it by the cell length, and that's your density. A better way to do that is to represent, to essentially use kernel density estimation, where you represent the presence of each of the vehicles by adding a Gaussian kernel that is centered at the position of this vehicle. When you sum up all of these Gaussian kernels, what you end up with is something that looks like the blue line. So it is essentially a smooth representation of the traffic density around there. Now, this traffic density, since we're relying on the one vehicle kind of sensing the traffic conditions around it, of course, this estimation of the traffic density will only be good in the vicinity of this vehicle itself. So, but in the vicinity of this vehicle itself, we might be able to see what are the traffic densities immediately around it, or what are the traffic densities a bit downstream, or what are the traffic densities a bit upstream. So we can reasonably assume that these will be the information that we can get from a vehicle, from a single instrument. So this gives us a picture of what is happening very narrowly around the vehicle, but the road is much longer than that. So we might need to do some processing in order to get a bit more complete picture of what's happening elsewhere on the road. So in particular, we need to do some traffic state reconstruction. What I mean by this is just going from the locally sensed data to a broader picture that is basically to estimate the traffic conditions farther away from this vehicle where the vehicle cannot see. And in order to do this, we use this Lagrangian sensed traffic data along the trajectory of the vehicle, essentially feed that into the traffic model, and essentially as the boundary conditions and set the boundary to the trajectory of this vehicle. And then if we evaluate the model forward in time, we can get the traffic state reconstruction. And as we're gathering more and more data, and as more time passes, the picture will be, well, we will know more and more about the overall traffic condition. Another thing that we need to do is, even if we have a good picture of what the current traffic state is, we then, of course, need to predict what the traffic state will be in the future if we want to design any kind of control that affects this traffic. And there are many ways we can do this. One way that I like to use is what I call the front tracking transition system model, where essentially I codify the front tracking numerical method for solving PDEs as a transition system. And with that system, what I'm able to do is to evaluate, to quickly predict how the traffic state will evolve based on what kind of a control action I take with my Lagrangian actuator acting, in this case, as a moving bottle. So in general, we need a prediction model. This prediction model needs to be able to evaluate how the traffic state will evolve based on what the control actions we take. I mean, it's pretty simple, pretty similar, pretty standard story. So before all of that, we do need to have a good model of how the traffic evolves. And that part is not necessarily that simple. In essence, since we have already this conservation law, the only thing that is missing there are the flux functions. So the flux function describing the open road and the flux function describing the influence of the moving bottleneck. As our Lagrangian sensor is moving, and the traffic data that it is collecting, which in this case will be the traffic density and the traffic speed, should essentially fit on what we will have as the flux function. So the traffic speed times traffic density should be, well, exactly the traffic flow that the flux function would predict. And as we are starting to gather more and more data, we should get a better and better picture of what this flux function should look like. So after some time, this is what we get. Now, for the moving bottleneck, for the effect of the moving bottleneck, the situation is a bit more complicated because we cannot directly measure the traffic state on this flux function. But instead, what we can do is we can rely on the fact that the downstream and upstream traffic conditions should follow this form that I talked about before. So essentially, the line connecting the traffic conditions downstream and upstream should be tangential, or should be a tangent to the moving bottleneck flux function, and its slope should be equal to the speed of this moving bottleneck. So essentially, by collecting more and more data, we are able to, in some sense, fit a moving bottleneck flux function that best describes this data. Once we have the model, once we have a reconstructed traffic state, we can actually start implementing some traffic control. And the control law in particular, so in particular here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to dissipate a stop and go wave. And the stop and go wave, well, first, what are the controlled inputs? Well, like I said, the speed of a moving bottleneck will be one control input. And then based on the how we arrange multiple vehicles, like let's say we have a platoon of vehicles and we can command them to take one lane or to take two lanes. So based on how we arrange them, we can be able to, well, we might be able to essentially control how much overtaking traffic flow they might admit. And that is the story that they had about blocking one lane or blocking two lanes or similar things like that. So based on their formation, the overtaking flow, the limitations on the overtaking flow might be another control input that we might be able to use. So overall, if we want to minimize the traffic total time spent, which is a general metric for how good the traffic is flowing, we just want to maximize early outflow. So we want to push as many vehicles out of the system as possible, as early as possible. Now, if there is a stop and go wave, then this stop and go wave will be acting as essentially a limit to how much throughput we can, the road can take, essentially. So then what we need to do instead is, first, we need to reduce the inflow to this stop and go wave to have it shrink over time, because its outflow will be constant in this case. So if the inflow to the stop and go wave is lower than its outflow, then the number of vehicles stuck in it should decrease until after some time it disappears. So it dissipates and disappears. So after that, we can basically go back to letting as many vehicles flow on the road as possible. So basically keeping the traffic flow as close as possible to its capacity. The way this looks when it comes to the traffic density evolution, the way this looks is something like this. So here in yellow, we have a zone of high density or higher density. So this is our stop and go wave. It might not be easy to see, but this red line, so down here, this is our moving bottleneck. So this is the zone where our moving bottleneck is impeding the traffic. What that does is it creates a zone of higher density upstream and a lower density downstream. And when this lower density traffic reaches the stop and go wave, it will basically start shrinking until it disappears. So in this case, it's not done in a very efficient way, but that's in general what you might expect. Now, if you have a single vehicle on a two-lane road, well, in order to dissipate a stop and go wave, we need to be able to restrict the inflow to a level that is lower than its outflow. So if you have a two-lane road and you're controlling a single vehicle, it might not be that hard to do, actually, because you're blocking half the flow, should be fine. However, if you have a multiple lane road and you're only controlling a single vehicle, then you might have a bit of a problem achieving this, because the outflow from the stop and go wave is reduced, but it will be reduced, but it's not that reduced. So essentially, what we can try doing is, instead of immediately controlling vehicles as moving bottlenecks, we might need an extra step. So first, what we can try doing instead is we can try to accumulate enough vehicles so that we have so that we have enough vehicles that we can create a unit that is driving together. And by doing that, we will now be able to block multiple lanes, or, well, in this case, 2 lanes out of 3. And if you're able to block multiple lanes, then you're likely to be able to restrict the inflow to the stop and go wave to a lower level than its outflow is. So essentially, first we select where we collect the vehicles, then the vehicles that are downstream slow down, the vehicles that are upstream speed up. Once we have enough vehicles, then we start acting as a moving bottleneck and dissipating the stop and go wave. And what the nice thing here is that we don't, so if we have a lower penetration rate of the vehicles, what that means is it would just take more time to collect enough vehicles in order to be able to implement this traffic control. But we will still be able to do the traffic control, but it'll take a bit more time. So that basically wraps up this full Lagrangian traffic control loop. So to recapitulate a bit, we use the vehicles as Lagrangian sensors to sense the traffic conditions. Based on the measurement, we learn the traffic model. With combining this learned traffic model and the measurements, we are able to reconstruct the broader traffic state. And then also applying the model, we predict the evolution of the traffic state based on the control action that we take. And ultimately, we're able to dissipate congestion on the road. So as an example, I give here a scenario where we have stop and go waves randomly arriving from the downstream end of some road, and they're being dissipated by multiple connected autonomous vehicles acting as moving bottlenecks. Well, the exact details are not that important. So what you see here is the situation without applying control. The yellow streaks are, in this case, the stop and go waves. So you can see that they persist, and as time goes on, they grow they grow larger. The red lines here are the trajectories of the connected autonomous vehicles. So in this case, these vehicles are not doing any control; they're simply flowing, following the flow of the traffic. Now, if we have full information about what's going on the road, we can start strategically slowing these vehicles down, having them act as moving bottlenecks, and then basically ensuring that these stop and go waves are dissipated sooner. So instead of having them evolve go on in time, these stop and go waves will be dissipated. Now, even if we do not have the full information about the traffic state nor the traffic model, then applying the model learning that I talked about in the traffic state reconstruction, we're still able to do a similar job. We're now, of course, because we have less information, the control performance is not as good, but we're still able to dissipate the traffic, the stop and go waves, and control the traffic. And you can see on the left how how these three cases compare in terms of total time spent. So in case of traffic performance, and on the right you see how in this case the learning the traffic model was evolving after collecting more and more data. That brings me to the end of the first part, and I will now transition to a bit more. So this was all talking about the general macroscopic models and how we control macroscopic models and similar things. Now I want to talk about something a bit more practical, and that is, well, if you have actual vehicles, well, what do we do with that? So the inspiration behind this part is that we wanted to try to, well, okay, in this case we have some traffic data. We have a specific problem that we're solving. We have a specific case of traffic control, and we were using this case to learn the traffic model. But here, what we were talking about is a bit different. We were trying to design specific traffic scenarios that will allow us to learn the traffic model. So what we did here was we had a single actuator vehicle that was inside some background traffic, and what we wanted to learn is basically how does this vehicle acting as a moving bottleneck affect the rest of the traffic. And we were doing that in microscopic simulation. You can see the situation, the simulated situation here. So first the vehicle is moving fast like this, so the camera is centered on it. Then once it slows down, you can see how some vehicles are starting to accumulate upstream of this vehicle and creating congestion. So as you would expect from the story from before, this essentially splits the road into two zones. The zone upstream has a higher density, that's basically the congestion created by this moving bottleneck, and the zone downstream has a lower density. And if we assume that this vehicle has some situational awareness, it can sense the vehicles around it, what that should give us is what that would give us is a way to essentially estimate what the upstream density is and upstream speed as well. So what the density and flow are upstream, and the same thing for downstream. So if we have these 2 points, density and flow, then we can start essentially plotting lines on the flux functions. So like I said, the line should have a slope that is equal to the speed of the moving bottleneck. And if we run this experiment for multiple moving bottleneck speeds, what that should give us is essentially a way to sample the flux function. I give a very loose representation of what the flux function might look like. What that gives us is basically a way to sample points on the flux function. Now, for the moving bottleneck flux function, the situation is a bit more complicated because we're not really able to sample points on it. But the point is, because all of these lines should be tangent to it, then this gives us a way to reconstruct it as a convex hull, or not a convex hull, a lower concave envelope of these lines, or to just do some parametric approximation and find what line works best, or find what point works best as the tip of this triangular flux function in this case. So here's what the model learning results look like. The blue flux function is the identified flux function of the open road, and then you have two moving bottleneck flux function in case that we saw before the sumo simulated case. So on the left you see the Gaussian kernel reconstructed traffic density of a sumo simulation. So there are actual individual vehicles that are participating and creating this traffic density on the left. And on the right, we see the prediction based on the model that we identified from these experiments. So if you look just visually, the pictures look quite similar, I would say. Of course, there is much more detail on the picture on the left, but that's because we have exact knowledge of where all of the vehicles were. But we are still able to predict the general trends of how the density will go. So the red line is the trajectory of the moving bottleneck, and in both cases we see some congestion building up upstream of the moving bottleneck, and in general we see a very similar behavior. The same thing happens when the traffic is lighter. So we correctly, with the previous level of traffic, we correctly predicted that there will be some congestion building up at the moving bottleneck. In case of lighter traffic, there's much less congestion in this case, and we correctly predict that as well. So that's all great, but there are three big problems, three major issues with this work. First one is the traffic model, the traffic simulation should be more realistic. Well, in particular, here we used Sumo as the or as the microscopic traffic simulator, and while the car following model was pretty good, so we used the intelligent driver model, we had instant lane changing. So basically, vehicles were teleporting to the next lane. Is that a problem? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it's not a very realistic situation at any rate. The second one is, in this case, what we assumed is that if a vehicle is close to our, in this case, Lagrangian agent, so our ego vehicle in essence, which in this case was the actuator vehicle acting as a moving bottleneck. So we assumed here that if a vehicle is close, like 100 meters away from it, that we just know its trajectory. And that is not a very realistic, it might not be a very realistic assumption to make. The third problem is we don't really know if this would really work with the human driver. So in this case, we have all of the vehicles were being just simulated. So whatever the microscopic model was saying would happen, that's basically what we assumed would happen in this case. So in order to fix this problem, we need a more realistic traffic model. We should use, probably should use a commercial microscopic simulator. Sumo is open source, it's great, but I mean, there are microscopic simulators that are in general seen to be more realistic. Especially we need a continuous lateral motion, so we need an actual representation of lane changing. We need a more realistic representation of sensing, I mean, we need some idea of what kind of sensor data we might expect from individual these vehicles. And we also need to not just assume that we know the trajectory of the vehicles, we need to see how we can track them using this kind of sensor data. And then finally, it would be great if we had a human driver involved in these simulations or in this experiment, and to see how this human driver will react to these kinds of these kinds of scenarios. So that's exactly what we did. So we we coupled the PTV-VISIM with a 3D interface, or a 3D representation. So basically we coupled it with Carla. Carla is allowing us now to have a 3D representation of what is happening in the traffic. We mounted a simulated LiDAR sensor on these Lagrangian agents. We had some vehicles where, basically we had two vehicles which we equipped with simulated LiDARs. So these LiDARs in this 3D simulated environment are able to do a more or less realistic scan of their environment. They're able to essentially see the vehicles that are in the vicinity. So you can see that this is kind of the point cloud that we would get that we simulate, you can see that there is a vehicle that is next to our ego vehicle, and then you can see some silhouettes further downstream. And then based on this LiDAR data, we're able to process the data, cluster it, and then track how these vehicles are moving on the road. So in general, we had furthermore, we had the hardware driving platform where we had my co-author, Gökçe, drive the one of these two vehicles. So we wanted to essentially replicate the experiment that I was talking about. We want to have one vehicle that is acting as an actuator vehicle, and this vehicle was simulated. We wanted to, like I said, we wanted to see how a human driver will react to this kind of a moving bottleneck traffic control maneuver. So we had the second vehicle, which was human driven. And what this vehicle was doing is basically just traveling with the flow of the rest of the traffic, entering the congestion caused by this moving bottleneck and just traversing it and continuing on. So essentially just a human driver participating in the traffic as the rest of the traffic on equal footing, essentially. So these two vehicles had the simulated LiDARs mounted on them, and then all of the other vehicles were purely simulated and were there to just act as the background traffic, essentially. So using this pipeline that I described, we were able for both of these vehicles to essentially get the local trajectories of the surrounding vehicles. Based on that, we were able to sense or estimate essentially the traffic conditions, so the traffic density and the average traffic speed. We put this information into the whole machinery that I was talking about before, learned the traffic model, and then finally reconstructed the overall traffic state. So on the very left, you see the ground truth using kernel density estimation to essentially get traffic density from raw vehicle trajectories. Now, even using only the model, which is equivalent to what we had for the previous case, in using the model, we are able to represent the evolution of the traffic relatively well. But then if we add the Lagrangian sense information from these two vehicles, then the reconstruction becomes even better. So basically, we are able to more or less predict what is going to happen with the ground truth evolution of the overall traffic conditions. So that brings me to the end of this talk. The question that we wanted to answer is how can we reduce traffic congestion using only a small portion of connected vehicles, which we can access, whose sensing data we can access to some degree, and whose actions we can control, again, to some degree. What I think is interesting is that the road traffic system is essentially it's one of the largest systems globally, and there is very, very little feedback control that is interacting with it. Like power system is probably larger, but there is actual control happening with the traffic. Well, here I'm talking about highways. Urban traffic, there are some controls there. I do think that connected vehicles bring an enormous untapped potential, both by using them in the ways that I described and many other ways. So I think we should probably be thinking about how best we can utilize them. I mean, using the data that a lot of vehicles, well, if you have binos running around, like they probably have a lot of data of the traffic around them. So if we had access to this data, we could probably do quite a bit. But then also, of course, in order to make sure that this actually works, we definitely need to perform more realistic experiments, hopefully on public roads. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and take any questions you might have.